Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Wolfman Winter. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was 14 or 15, my mother and I went to stay at a friend's cabin in the woods for the winter. It was a bad time for my family. My biological father was trying to do violent things against both me and my mom, and this was why we fled to the middle of nowhere. I had to skip an entire semester and a half of school, which both Mom and I later took a lot of crap over, but it was literally a matter of life and death at the time when it all went down. My father got arrested for an entirely unrelated crime, and by the next spring he was sentenced to 15 years in prison in a different state. After that, Mom and I were able to cautiously start to resume our lives. But I didn't grow up hating men as a lot of other young girls in this kind of a bad family situation. In fact, the only reason we survived that cold winter was because of a strong male role model figure, the first I had really had in my life, who was positive. The problem is that this role model was not even human. He was a large, overly muscular giga-chad of a dogman. He had the head of a wolf and the body of Arnold Schwarzenegger, only furry. And as frightening a figure as he was at first glance, he was our protector and savior in the end. In nature, when you look small and weak and defenseless, there is usually a predator of some sort who will pounce on the opportunity to exploit that. For some reason, during our Wolfman Winter, Mom and I had an apex predator who decided to keep us out of harm's way. I still don't really know why either. The first incident could have and should have been the last. Strong winds in a storm blew a tree over the top of the cabin we were staying in. Although the impact had been great, the roof was holding for the moment. It's just that the full weight of the tree was on top, and as snow continued to fall on top of that tree, adding to its weight, it became clear that it was only going to be a matter of time until the ceiling caved in under the increasing pressure. In the middle of the night, we heard the great tree moving and scraping against the house, and we thought it was all over. We expected the roof to cave in, so we both ran outside and looked up. What we saw at first made no sense to us. The tree appeared to be lifting up. Walking around to get a better vantage point, we saw that the tree was being lifted off the house by some kind of Marvel Comics superhero. It was like the Hulk, but with Batman ears up on top, if that makes sense. This immense man, who was 7 feet tall if he was an inch, tilted the tree and then pushed it off in a different direction. It crashed harmlessly to the snowy forest floor, raising a big cloud of snow and water and vapor. Then we watched as this comic book superhero walked diagonally back towards the woods he had apparently come out of. As he passed nearest to us, he turned to look calmly in our direction. He had a wolf-like face that also seemed incredibly intelligent, maybe even smarter than we were. He was certainly smarter about living in those woods. The beastman sort of grunted at us, and you could see the white steam coming from his nose as he did so. It felt like he was giving us the all clear to head back inside the cabin, which is exactly what we did. I have no idea how we would have survived that night, let alone the winter, if the huge superhuman dogman had not come along to rescue us. Although we were fine physically, the incident really upset my mother, and she cried for days afterward. I think it was easier for me to accept because I was young. Mom not only had to accept that we had been rescued by a werewolf, but she also had to wrap her mind around the very idea that a wolfman or dogman could even be a real thing. I used to love science fiction and horror movies, so the idea of what had just happened was easier for me to accept. Mom had never believed in monsters, other than Dad, of course. She had never had much time for fantasy or the supernatural in her life. She was about cleaning the house and making dinner and making sure the house was locked up tight before we went to bed. Mom was about security and logic. In spite of the fact that the dogman had saved our cabin and probably our lives, he made Mom feel insecure. His existence itself was purely illogical, at least in her mind. I don't know how he sensed we were running out of firewood and food, but one early morning, I saw the Dogman going out to our woodshed, carrying something with him. I woke Mom and we both sat by the window and watched the Beastman leaving the woodshed and returning with thick tree branches. He must have made 8 or 10 trips before finally leaving and staying gone. Mom and I waited a good long time to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then we cautiously tiptoed through the snow over to the shed to figure out what the creature had been doing. Well, the woodshed for starters was full of wood again. The creature seemed to have torn branches off old dying trees with his great strength, and had placed them in here for them to dry out for us. The beast understood firewood. What animal understands firewood? In addition, there was a log with a concave surface on top, and that bowl-like shape was filled with nuts. There were hickory nuts and both light and dark kinds of walnuts. A large collection of them, presumably left for us as an offering. Once again, the creature had probably saved our lives. He gave us fuel for our bellies and fuel for the fireplace. How could we have survived without him? One of the things we did that winter was sew. The real owner of the cabin was a seamstress. There were sewing supplies there and we had a lot of free time, so Mom taught me how to do all the things she knew. Then when I caught up to her, we started to read the manuals and patterns and learn how to do more. Mom helped me make a little stuffed doll, maybe about 10 or 11 inches tall. It was basically a little pillow, but we made it in the shape of the Dogman, and we used this dark gray material to create it out of. In the end, we found these 2 bright, shiny yellow buttons and sewed them in where the eyes would go. For the rest of the time we were in that cabin, we slept with the stuffed Dogman in the bed with us. Somehow it made us feel safer. In the spring, we heard from some people about my father's imprisonment, and we decided to walk out of the cabin and back to civilization. On the dark early morning when we set out to go, trudging through the woods where there was still some melting snow around here and there, I suddenly noticed the Dogman was in the woods walking alongside of us. He had apparently come to see us off. I felt overcome with emotion, and against my mother's wishes, I tore off running toward the monster. By the time I had reached the place where I had seen him, he was no longer there. I walked around, but I saw nothing, and I couldn't hear him either. Feeling that he was still there somewhere watching me, I called out to him that I had something for him. Then I got the Dogman stuffed doll out of my bag, and I placed it gently and respectfully on the root of a large tree. I leaned it against the trunk so it stood up on its hind legs, same as the real Dogman did. I called out to him that we had to leave, but that we thanked him. I told him that the doll was my attempt to pay him back for all he had done for us. I heard nothing, and then I walked back to my mother. As I reached her, she and I started saying something or other when there was a noise behind me. I looked at where I had been, and that Dogman doll was no longer where I had left it. I guessed that the Beastman had accepted my gift to him, and I felt a great sense of closure and gratitude. I don't know if that man-thing was a Dogman or a werewolf or a skinwalker or what. I just know he was generous. He was kind. He was our white knight Sir Galahad. He was the only reason that we survived. The Wolfman Winter. Dogman versus Bigfoot in my pool. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw 2 monsters one summer night when I was sleeping over my cousin Vito's house in eastern Pennsylvania. We were in a small town just a few miles to the northwest of Philadelphia, which is not really supposed to be prime territory for either Dogman or Bigfoot sightings. The event that Vito and I witnessed was one that I failed to film with my Super 8 camera, but it will stay alive in my memory for however much longer God allows me to live among you kind people. If you haven't figured it out by now, my story happened a very long time ago. It was either 1973 or it was 1974, I think. That would have made me and Vito either 13 or 14 years old when this all happened. I was staying over for 2 or 3 weeks that summer, and on this night, Vito's parents had driven a long way off to attend a friend's birthday party or anniversary party or something like that. They weren't going to get back till 3 or 4 in the morning, and there was a chance they might just sleep over at the party, then drive back the following day. Since it was Saturday night, that meant Vito and I could watch the Saturday night scary movies all night. This was before computers and cell phones and so forth, and chiller theater and creature feature movies on TV were the most exciting things that happened in our 13 or 14-year-old lives. We were watching a weird movie about Barbara Steele and a castle. I've never seen that one a second time. I can't recall too much about it. Although we both liked Barbara Steele, neither of us were getting into this movie. We were more interested in monsters than psychological horror or whatever this was. We wanted to see The Mummy or Frankenstein or something like that. Because the movie wasn't holding our interest, but it was creating a creepy vibe and mood, we sort of turned the audio up to listen to the soundtrack and wandered around Vito's parents' house. I forget the details, but they were not exactly the owners of the place, or something like that. It really belonged to some older relative maybe, or possibly the owners had passed away. I can't really recall exactly, it was 50 years ago. My point is that there was a lot of old stuff that belonged to earlier generations all around us in that house. I don't know that the place was haunted. In fact, I don't think it was, but it sure looked like it should be. Everything in that house was an antique. It felt like we were on the Dark Shadows TV show. Although the inside of the house dated back a long way, it had an in-ground swimming pool in the back that looked like it was maybe 10 years old at the oldest. That was where Vito and I spent a lot of time that summer, which I remember being a hot one. At one point I was coming back from getting snacks in the kitchen when I looked out the window and I saw something that made me drop what I was holding and run back upstairs. I locked Vito's bedroom door and I turned the sound down on his TV. Then I cautiously led him to the window and silently pointed down to the swimming pool in the backyard. There was something drinking water from the edge of the pool. Something big and brown and down on all fours. I mean really big. Vito took one look, gasped, and said, "Oh, water buffalo." It wasn't a water buffalo, but I couldn't tell him what it was. The brown furry thing was down on all fours and leaning over into the pool to drink water. I was thinking that it might be a large dog. It was the size of a bear, but the fur was not the same as a bear's fur. At least not the bears I had seen when my parents took me to see Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey's circus. This fur was longer and darker and more matted and gross looking. When that thing finished drinking, it sort of leaned back and lifted its head up, which was shaped like a dog or wolf head. Vito called it a muscle-bound jackal, which stuck in my head all these years. I didn't know what a jackal looked like, but I just thought it sounded cool, muscle-bound jackal. So the thing sort of howled briefly. Then it did the strangest thing I could ever imagine. This four-legged creature leaned back and sort of tipped itself upright, so that it was now standing up on its hind legs like a man. And once it was back on those hind legs, now towering up in the air, it let loose with an even longer, even louder, even more mournful howl. This wolf howled like he was singing the blues or something. I wondered who a giant beast like that could be howling to. Would his howling attract another creature as large as he was? Would his howling attract something even larger? But as we watched and as I wondered these things, his howl was interrupted as another large figure leaped into view and tackled the wolfman around his midsection. The force of the impact sent both creatures crashing and splashing into the water, a huge wave of which rose out of the pool and fell onto the grass lawn beyond it. When the foam and water settled, we saw two creatures down below, submerged in the water up to their shoulders, facing each other, grimacing and baring their teeth. They glared at each other as though they were old enemies. They did not seem surprised to see each other. But my cousin Vito and I, well, we were pretty freaking surprised to see both of them. At this point, we were scrambling through Vito's closet and his parents' bedroom closet, looking for cameras that might have some film left in them. My Super 8 had no batteries left. We wanted to take a picture or some 8mm film of the creatures fighting in the pool down below, but we were not finding anything that had both film and a flash. In retrospect, a flash wasn't going to help us in that context, but it was the 70s and we were kids. and we didn't really understand any of that yet. After some time of trying to find a camera that was working, but failing in the task, we retreated back to Vito's room to watch the spectacle playing out down below. So there was a lot of splashing and there was a lot of screaming, but there didn't seem to be a lot of connecting between the two of them. It was sort of like Jake Paul versus a 58-year-old Mike Tyson. A lot of fuss, but not too many blows connecting. So the second figure, the one that tackled the dog-headed one, this seemed to be a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It did not have ears up on top of its head, and although it did have a bit of a snout, which it would make longer when hooting and hollering, he did not have the long dog nose and canine fangs of the first one, the buffalo-sized dog that we saw drinking chlorine water from the pool. We were watching an ape-like creature battle something that looked and acted like a werewolf from out of legend. It didn't have clothes on. It wasn't a Lon Chaney kind of werewolf. It was too big for that. But it was a wolf-headed creature that walked like we do. Both of them were too large to be guys in costumes, and both were ripped. I mean like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, overly muscled. They were making it clear they didn't like each other, but they were really not making it very clear what they were going to do about that, other than empty half the pool water out onto the walkway and lawn. But then the werewolf picked up that net thing that was laying by the pool. I forget what they're called, but it's that thing you use to pick leaves and crap out of the water to clean the pool up. This long metal and plastic stick thing with a net at the end of it. And he swings it and whacks the Sasquatch right square on the noggin in the process while he does so. Crack! And that Bigfoot, he started making a sound like a baby crying. I'm not even kidding. He sounded like a crying baby. And the next thing you know, he just sort of disappeared in a flash of light. Like zoot. And then there was only one monster in the pool down below. Nobody believes us with that part of the story, but the Bigfoot did not run away. He sort of lit up bright and then disappeared. Vito and I screamed when we saw this. I mean, it was a shocking thing to see. You would have probably shouted a bit as well. But the thing is, when we made all that noise, that werewolf or dogman, the one still left in the pool down below, the original buffalo-sized animal we had seen drinking from the pool, well, he turned his head. He looked right up at us in our window. That shut us up inside of 1 second, and we found ourselves staring down at the Wolfman, who was staring right back up at us. I have nightmares about this moment. It felt like we were standing there forever, literally for all of time. The dogman's eyes looked like they had living flames inside of them. I felt like, by the way it was looking at me, that it was telling me that it had come from hell, and that it wanted to bring someone back home with it. We might still be there staring at that thing's eyes to this day, a half-century later, but the beast broke our stare and began running toward the base of the house. We could hear sounds below, and we both got the impression that the dogman was attempting to scale or climb the outside of the house itself in order to get up at us in Vito's bedroom. We ran out into the hallway and for some reason chose a closet to hide inside of. We heard sounds outside for a long while, but we couldn't tell for sure if the Wolfman had gotten into the house or not. For this reason, we stayed inside that closet in the hallway, trying to get some rest in cramped quarters until Vito's wristwatch said it was 6 a.m. When we opened that closet door, I wasn't sure what we were going to see. Did the monster get inside? Did it trash the place? Would it still be inside waiting for us? Well, first peek out into the hallway looked pretty ordinary. When we got up our courage, we checked Vito's room, which was no messier than usual. His window seemed intact and did not look broken into. Heading downstairs, we found the pool really had been half emptied of its water the night before. We had not hallucinated the monster fight. It had to have really happened. And there was some digging over by the base of the house under Vito's window, so I guess the creature had actually tried to get into the house. But instead of climbing up to the window as we had expected him to do, I guess maybe he tried to dig under the house? Well, dogman gonna dog, as they say. Actually, nobody says that. So we did tell people about what happened, But we were both kids who were into monsters. We were kids who were known to fantasize a lot. We knew very little of math or science, yet we knew all about Godzilla and the creature from the Black Lagoon. So our female relatives told us to be quiet about it, while our male relatives humored us, as though we were telling fish stories. Pretty soon after that, Vito and I shifted our interest to girls and women, so we kind of dropped the monster stuff on our own. In those days, ladies didn't want to hear you talking about Bigfoot or Dogman. Maybe they still don't, I wouldn't know. For decades, I didn't want to talk about this because I was trying hard to seem sane and get along in the world. And now I'm old, though, and I just don't care how crazy people might think I am anymore. Maybe I'm just a nutty old boomer like this guy on Facebook called me last week. But I'm a nutty old boomer who once saw a Bigfoot fighting a Dogman in my cousin Vito's swimming pool in eastern Pennsylvania. Dogman versus Bigfoot in my hot tub. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a weird story for you about the time I saw two cryptids at the same time. This was way back in the 1990s in northern Michigan. I don't remember exactly where. It was a house I rented as a winter getaway for me and this girl that I'd been seeing. It had a hot tub outside in the snow, and we'd have to run about 20 feet through that snow to get to it, and then the same to get back to the house. Of course, running back to the house, we'd be warm from the hot tub and hardly feeling it, but running from the house through the snow barefoot could be quite invigorating, to say the least. So one night we were getting into our bathing suits to go sit in the hot tub when my girlfriend walked outside, screamed, and ran back inside. She slammed the door behind her and was hyperventilating and finding it impossible to speak words that made any sense to me. After some time, she told me that there was a giant bear in the hot tub, and I was like, holy free holy, you know? So I led her upstairs and we found a window overlooking the hot tub to see what was happening. What we saw was not one bear down there, but two. They seemed to have different colored fur. They were very agitated, and they were standing up on their hind legs. Both of them were making angry-sounding noises and raising their clawed paws up in the air. They were on either side of the hot tub, and that seemed to be what they were fighting over. Each of them tried to look bigger and more frightening than the other one. The two began circling the hot tub, each one waiting for the other to make some tactical error. They would bluff charge, then retreat, and neither one was dominating, yet neither one would retreat either. My girlfriend was growing agitated. She kept asking why I wasn't doing something, and I kept saying I was doing something. I was waiting, and I was observing. I asked her to explain to me what we were looking at, and she screamed at me that she didn't know what we were looking at. I was like, exactly. So let me observe what's going on, and then maybe I can understand it. Then maybe if I can comprehend what's happening, I can figure out how to resolve this. I thought I was making sense, but she went right back to screaming at me. I tried to block her out mentally, and I just looked out there at the situation. One of those creatures was like a dog-headed Bigfoot, while the other one just sort of looked like a Bigfoot. They both had fur that was different shades of brown from each other, and they both had clawed hands, as I remember it. One of them had tall dog ears, though, and it made him resemble a werewolf more than a Sasquatch. The other one had a more ape or gorilla-like head, so I call him a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. They were so similar in size to each other. I kind of found that the most bizarre part. They were taller than bears, and nothing is supposed to exist that's their size. Yet here we were looking at two of them, as though being 10 or 11 feet tall were the normal way of nature in the late 20th century. It most definitely was and is not. What were the chances of seeing one anomaly like this, let alone two? Years later, I was talking with this native guy who told me I was near a portal on that night. I had to have been, he said. And he said that when you're near a portal, the chances of seeing one cryptid are about the same as seeing 2 or 3 or more. It isn't the same as seeing normal animals. It's a different thing entirely. These are visitors to our reality. At least that's what my native acquaintance insisted to me years after the incident. But back on the night when it was happening, those beasts seemed very real to me. My girlfriend got fed up with me waiting and watching, and she burst out of the back door and into the cold night. Standing there just outside the house, she stamped her foot and demanded the monsters go away and leave us alone. That caused them to stop posturing for each other, to stop trying to scare each other, and they both turned to look at and fixate on my girlfriend. When she realized they had gone silent, and that she had 4 glowing predator eyes focused on her, she got quiet as well, and silently backtracked into the house. She closed the door as gently and quietly as she could. Count 1, 2, then BAM! Both hairy beastmen charged the back door of the house, and my girlfriend and I ran upstairs insanely. We spent that night listening to the creatures down below, banging on the walls and doors of the house. I kept waiting for the sound of breaking glass, but I never heard it. When we got up with the sun the next morning, we couldn't even find footprints of the creatures in the snow outside, and there was nothing wrecked or destroyed that we could make out. Much of the snow seemed melted much more than it should have been so quickly, but I can't really explain why that would be. At any rate, we cut the rest of our vacation short and went home to spend it in my apartment, taking hot showers together. Sure, it's more cramped than a hot tub, but the shower has one distinct advantage over a hot tub. No cryptids allowed. John Carnagan can do no wrong. You know he got it going on. Please join me in thanking John Carnagan for donating to us using our thanks button located under each of our YouTube videos. John is also a channel member, so he gets to see our secret uncensored Dogman stories, far too wild to run on this channel. Werewolves are liars. Dear Scary Stories NYC, people tell me that there are different kinds of werewolves, but I only know one kind, and that kind of werewolf is a liar. 100% guarantee every single time. If you know about some other kinds of werewolves, please tell me in a comment under this video, and in the meantime I'll explain why I feel the way I do. I used to date a werewolf. I didn't know that's what she was at first. I just thought Barbara was a hot redhead, you know what I mean? I think I found out that she was a werewolf around the same time I found out that she was a liar. Let me try to remember exactly how it all went down. The two of us had decided to attend a beach party that one of my bosses was throwing. Almost everybody there was over my head socially and financially, and I was hoping Barb and I could make some good connections and get ahead in business. But once we got there, I lost her in the crowd somehow. I kept mingling throughout the night and asking people if they had seen Barbara anywhere. I got negative responses for the longest while, until one person I asked pointed off in the distance and asked, "Isn't that her with that muscular new intern?" Sure enough, it was my girl, and her arms were wrapped all around a young gentleman who indeed had a muscular frame. I saw red. I felt red. I heard red. Steam came out of my ears and my nose as I charged over to ask the two of them exactly what was going on, as quietly but forcefully as I could manage under the circumstances. Barbara wasted no time in lighting into me, shouting loudly about private matters. People were pointing at me and laughing as she bellowed out details of things I had never thought she would ever share with anyone for any reason. She stormed off, and like a confused mouse, I followed after her. I was hurt and I was taken by surprise. I thought everything was okay between us, and I wanted to understand what was happening. She told me she had never been faithful to me, and she started listing affairs she had been having with friends I thought I could trust. She tore my entire world down around me and laughed as she did it. And then, when the two of us were completely alone and away from the other partygoers, sort of underneath this old pier-type construction, she turned on me, and I watched her become a monster, something as hideous on the outside as she had always been on the inside. First, her eyes started glowing an unnaturally bright amber sort of color. Then I noticed she had dog ears, like wolf ears I mean, up on top of her head, not on the sides. It didn't take long for her to become something like out of a horror movie, still wearing her t-shirt and jeans, but she wasn't a human being anymore inside of those clothes. I was looking at a creature with a dog head, covered in fur. I was not looking at my cheating girlfriend at all. I screamed in fear and ran away from there, off the beach and to my car, escaping her and going to stay for the night in a motel where I hoped she would not be able to find me. I was so scared that I didn't get much sleep at all. Well, you would have thought that was the end of our relationship, and let's face it, it was, but unfortunately I continued to know her for some time afterward. She mocked me to all my friends and coworkers, some of whom she had had relations with. While I felt some sick sense of loyalty to her for some reason, I never told anyone back then that she was a werewolf, for one thing. I don't know if anyone would have believed me, but in either case I kept it to myself. In retrospect, that seems insane to me, but that's the truth of what happened. I also stayed friends and coworkers with a number of the guys she had cheated on me with. I wasn't really in a position to just quit my job, so there wasn't much I could do about it. I would have liked to go move to Honolulu and begin a fabulous new life, but instead I stayed in the Midwest and I ate dog crap from these guys, who viewed me as a laughingstock. One of them moved in with me for a while, but I kicked him out after he, too, became a werewolf. Long before I noticed that he was a creature like Barbara, I noticed that he had begun lying to me. He lied to me even when he had no reason to lie to me. He lied to me even when he knew I already knew the truth. He sometimes gave me 2 or 3 stories about the same incident, and each story contradicted the other ones. It reminded me of my later days with Barbara. She had begun lying to me that same way, but I was initially in denial about it. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things because I thought I was in love with that girl. Well, I didn't think I was in love with this guy, so it was a lot easier for me to spot the lying. And since I knew for a fact that he hadn't always been that way, he used to be honest, I knew something had changed. Something had made him this new way, and my first guess was that it was Barbara. I guessed that he was a werewolf, and so I set about to antagonize him. Barbara had only transformed in front of my eyes after I got her good and agitated, so that was my plan with this evil doofus. He got home after work one night and I just started picking on him. Whatever he said, I disagreed. Whenever possible, I reminded him of lies he had told me and times he had lied to me. We began arguing, and then it got louder and more heated. This guy had a hotter temper even than Barbara, and it was like Shazam how fast he changed from Billy Batson to Captain Wolfman. There wasn't any lightning bolt, and I didn't hear the theme song playing in the background, but it happened as fast as a jump cut on an old Saturday morning TV show. And when this dude became a wolfman, I, for some reason, wasn't as scared of him as I was when I had seen Barbara change. Maybe it's because it wasn't the first time, I don't know. Maybe it was just that I was half expecting to see this jerk change. I had guessed that he was a werewolf, and so when I finally saw him change, it only sort of made me angrier at him. This guy went from being about my height and weight to much larger and 3 or 4 times as bulky. Barbara hadn't really changed in size, she just grew a snout and some fur. This guy hulked out. I don't know how such a thing is even possible. How can this much matter turn into 3 times as much matter in a few seconds? I used to have a trippy girlfriend who told me that there is no such thing as matter, that is really all energy. I guess that explains it as well as saying it was magic, right? Sometimes when I tell this story, people say that I didn't really see a werewolf. I only thought I was seeing one. They interpret it as this guy either drugging me or pulling some kind of stage magic illusion on me. But he changed into a big hairy monster standing right there in my living room. I'm certain it was real. And while he tried to intimidate me, I just shouted him down and gave him a piece of my mind, to quote that scene in The Howling. Little werewolf in-joke there. Actually, it wasn't even that I shouted, I just kept talking. Now that he was a werewolf, there wasn't much he could say to interrupt me with as I stood there, calmly listing his faults. I started with the stuff he knew that I knew about, and then I kept going on, insulting him about things that he thought he had kept a secret from me. After some time, he retreated to his bedroom and slammed the door. On that night, I got to see a werewolf sulk. So it should be clear from these anecdotes that werewolves, or at least this kind of werewolf, do retain at least some of their human consciousness while in the wolf form. If my roommate had been all animal, he wouldn't have even been understanding what I was saying, let alone feeling bummed out about it. He would have just struck me down and devoured me, right? This is one of the reasons people keep telling me that there's more than one kind of a werewolf in the world. They tell me they never even heard of the kind that I'm describing, but I know they're real. They tore my entire life apart, at least until I could get another job in a different state and reboot everything from scratch. Things still kind of suck for me, but the level of suckage is not nearly as severe as it once was. I did have one final run-in with Barbara about a week before I was moving out of town. She was acting nice, and seemed a bit sad to learn I was moving away. She and I got to talking about old times, and we went for a walk through the woods we were near. Barbara was acting romantic, and began quietly begging me for a goodbye kiss. Or more than a kiss, but she was asking for attention. I was tempted, but it seemed like a bad idea, and I tried to tell her that in a nice way. She screamed loudly, hurting my ears and scaring the crap out of me. Then she started shouting that I was doing things to her, and 3 big guys came out of the woods, one of whom I recognized. That guy screamed out my name and said I was a dead man. Then all 3 of them at once, bam! They were wolfmen, larger than before with torn clothing. And they were walking slowly, but determinedly, toward me. I reached in my pocket and grabbed my phone, fumbling with the thing to get my camera app on. The wolfmen moved toward me, and I turned my back to them, succeeding in getting the camera app on. I took a flash photo of Barbara, and they all knew the app was on. By the time I'd spun around to photograph them as well, they were back to their human forms and they were running away. So that tells us something else. They do not want people to know about their particular kind of werewolf abilities. They ran away rather than risk me getting a picture of any of their faces. And when I turned back around, I found Barbara had left the scene as well. Fortunately for me, I haven't had any more run-ins with anybody from that town in the years since I moved out. So, like I said, there are supposedly a few different kinds of werewolves out there in the world. I myself have only met this one kind. And what I've learned from my experiences with them is this. Werewolves are liars. Dogman versus Goatman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. In and around Hubertus, Wisconsin, is a stretch of road called Hogsback. It runs through a mountainous, forested area, and some people say it's haunted by the Goatman. Originally, this Goatman was said to be a ghost, but eventually, in time, he became a man with a goat head and goat legs, a kind of a devil running around the countryside. This is what my friends and I were hoping to run into when we went cruising that night in the 1980s on Hogsback Road. I mean, the Goatman had been reported since the 1800s, so we didn't really expect to see it. The guy would have been over 100 years old. We never expected to actually witness a sighting of him, and yet witness the being we did. So we did eventually see exactly what we went there for. It's just that first, we saw the Dogman. The Dogman, as you already know, is a different Wisconsin legend, but one that my friends and I hadn't actually heard of yet at that point. Dogman stories also date back to the 1800s, but for some reason, my family and my friends' families had never heard of any Dogman stories back then in the 80s. We had all heard of the Goatman of Hogsback Road, however. So when we parked along the side of the road and turned all the car lights off, sitting in the pitch dark night, even though we really didn't expect anything to happen, it was still really scary, like petrifyingly scary. We all kept saying that we felt like we were being watched. Well, all of us except for this girl Barbara, who was dating my boyfriend Steve's brother, whose name I forget. I haven't seen any of these people in over 30 years, although I somehow became Facebook friends with Barbara's sister and niece. So what was I saying? Oh yeah, Barbara was annoyed at how scared the rest of us were getting, and she made fun of us rudely. She told Steve's brother that she wanted to get out and stretch her legs. Usually Steve's brother would jump at any chance to be alone with Barbara, but this time he admitted that he was too scared to get out of that car. Scared of the Goatman, Barbara sneered. She made fun of the boy, challenging his masculinity and the whole 9 yards. But he didn't care. He was scared enough to be willing to give up this girlfriend. That's how scared he was of the Goatman. Of course, this damaged Barbara's ego, and a woman's ego is the last thing you want to insult. We females have no moral restrictions in terms of lashing out at you if you insulted our ego. This is why it's so important to answer correctly when asked if an outfit makes your wife's butt look big. I don't know what the correct answer to that question actually is, but I can guarantee you that I will punish my man if he answers it wrong. So would any woman worth her salt. You'd lose your membership card if you didn't. So Barbara, infuriated, insulted, and also not at all afraid of monsters which she didn't believe in, got out of the car and walked off into the woods in the night alone. This was a very surprising development, as she was not wearing shoes that were good for a forest. In fact, her entire outfit was more of a clubby kind of ensemble than a hiking one, if you know what I mean. She looked like she was set to go dancing, but she was walking into the trees at night instead. We all called to her to come back, but nobody had the guts to go out after her, not even her guy. This sort of spoiled the mood, but we didn't feel any less scared to be where we were. Everybody wanted to leave, and we called out of the windows to Barbara telling her it was time to go. Well, I don't know if Barbara heard us, but I know someone did. Out into the road walked a furry, muscle-bound dogman, although I think that we called it a werewolf that night. It was not like a movie werewolf. It wasn't wearing torn-up clothing. I got the impression it was a wild animal, not a shapeshifter. It was walking upright on its hind legs like a human being, but its legs looked very canine to me, like the hind legs of a dog, but somehow supporting the weight of the entire frame tilted up on those legs. There was no question this was not a person in a costume because he was just too tall. I think he might have been 8 feet, possibly even taller, like a bear's size more than a human size. It had walked out onto the road quickly when we were all shouting, and now that it saw that we were the source of the noise, it started to slowly walk over to us. He kind of looked curious, but he also kind of looked very, very cranky. We had been afraid before, but this caused an entirely new and different kind of fear. Suddenly we all felt afraid for our lives. Suddenly we all thought of Barbara out in the woods on her own. Like I said, this was a new and different kind of a fear. I have to say, at first our screaming got louder, calling out to Barbara to come back at once. But when the big old werewolf-looking dogman creature came walking closer to us, we quieted down very quickly. The next part was quite surreal. Actually, all of these memories are. The creature walked toward us, and Steve said that was the weirdest bear he'd ever seen. I said its legs are too long to be a bear, and Steve said that's my point. The proportions were more like a man than a bear, but it was covered in thick fur all over, including on its belly and chest. The dogman would pause to study us, then advance, then pause. It walked all the way down one side of the car, then turned around and walked back. It had completely circled us, then returned to its original position to stare and glare and generally intimidate. The two boys were stuttering and wondering out loud what to do. The creature seemed to be getting angry at us. It bore its teeth, and I, for one, couldn't just sit there doing nothing anymore. I leaned over and pushed on the car horn. The dogman jumped in the air, and so I did it again. With an expression on its dog face like I was wrapping it with a rolled-up newspaper, the beast withdrew to the darkness under the trees. I said, "Let's go, let's get out of here." But the boys both reminded me that Barbara was still somewhere out in those woods. They didn't want to leave, but neither of them had the nerve to go out in the dark and look for the girl either. I asked them if they were really going to make me go look for her, and that shamed them into putting on their big boy pants. Steve's brother decided to go out and look for Barbara, while Steve stayed and protected me. But before he could actually leave the car and do something, the main event of this story took place. Out of the bushes in front of us ran Barbara, only she didn't seem to even notice that we were there. She was running from something that sure looked to me like it was the Goatman. Maybe he was over 100 years old, but he was still spry, and he was catching up to Barbara. It looked like the girl was going to get finished by the Goatman right in front of our eyes. Now, when I say it was the Goatman, I mean it looked like the great god Pan, and it looked like the devil. Its head was like a goat's head, with those scary, weird goat eyes. Its legs were like goat legs too, but its chest and arms were like a furry human. To me, the creepiest thing of all about the creature was that it had two horns sticking up out of the top front of its skull. They kind of curled and they came to painful-looking pointed ends. Steve told me later that he saw a second, dark black Goatman that was taking up the rear of the chase, but I didn't notice that myself. I just saw that this girl was in trouble. But then, out of the woods burst the dogman that we had seen earlier. It seemed to have joined the Goatman in chasing Barbara, and if Steve was right about a third creature being there, then you might have thought this girl's goose was cooked. The thing is, the dogman seemed to prefer goat meat to Barbara, and then the next thing you knew, the Goatman was standing tall against the Wolfman, and that werewolf was standing up as tall as he could against the Goatman. While this was going on, Barbara just kept running until she realized she was running toward the car we were in. It was like she snapped out of a daze and threw herself inside the car. Now both she and I were screaming at the boys that we wanted to get the heck out of there. While the rest of the story felt like a slow-motion nightmare to me as it played out in real life, we basically just backed away from the fight scene far enough that we could make a U-turn and leave. The Black Goatman was definitely not part of that fight, if there had ever been one there in the first place. Even Steve admits that as we backed away from there, it was the Dogman wailing on the one Goatman, and the darker one was nowhere to be seen any longer. Now, if you would like me to explain how any of this story could have possibly happened, I'm afraid I cannot. If you want me to explain why I never saw anything else weird or paranormal again for the rest of my life, again I have no idea what the reason might be. Maybe it was the combination of the four of us that drew the cryptids in. Maybe it was our young age. Maybe it was the Lover's Lane energy that made the magic happen. Maybe there was a portal open to another dimension on that night. I remember that Steve's mother had some old-fashioned beliefs that she said her grandmother taught her. In whatever country their family was from, all cryptids were thought of as devils, essentially. They are the old pre-Christian gods fallen into demonic behavior and attitudes. Sometimes they look like upright walking wolves. Sometimes they look like Sasquatch. Sometimes they look like the Goatman. But in her view, and the worldview handed down to her, these are the beings who see themselves as better than us. Yet they know God values us above them, and it drives them to petty jealousy and bad behavior. Doing all that won't make God love them better. It will only make us humans fear them more. And we should fear them, because they are jealous of us, and they want to replace us. Because according to this view, we are really witnessing God form against God form when we lay our eyes upon Dogman versus Goatman. That story was submitted by a lady who asked to remain anonymous, but the legend she is writing about, of the Goatman of Hogsback Road, that is a legend that I was recently reading about in this 2017 book, The Inhumanoids. He has a number of historical reports of the creature in the chapter named after the Goatman. He also has true stories of Dogman, Lizardman, and lots more, and we've got a link to pick up a copy of the book in our description. If you use that link, this channel makes a small commission, and we'd really appreciate that. And now here's your old pal Bigfoot with a little movie review about werewolves. Biggie? Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot, and I just got to see a sneak preview of the new Steve Grillo movie called Werewolves. Steve Grillo is this action star type of guy with lots of muscles, and he never smiles. There isn't much left to smile about in this movie anyway, since it's the zombie apocalypse. Only in this movie, instead of turning into zombies, people turn into werewolves. But only when it's night. When it's daytime again, everybody's normal again. I will say this movie takes a really long time setting up and getting started. You don't get to see any werewolves for a long time. It's a very slow build. That having been said, once they are on screen, they are fantastic looking, and there are a lot of them. Sometimes you see 3 werewolves at a time on screen, and each one is an individual, unique from the others, since each is based on the human character they were at first, before they changed. I'm not much of a fan of most of the human stories in any monster movie, and that's true for this one too. But with a movie like this, the important part is the monsters. And this movie, at least the second half of this movie, goes way over the top in that department. I saw werewolves do things in this flick that I never saw werewolves do before. They're sculpted by a guy named Peter Murphy, no, not that Peter Murphy, who did makeup effects on Alien Romulus and the 2 Smile films. And they are fully articulated heads with moving lips and mouths. Although I do not think this is as good a movie as Dog Soldiers, I think these werewolves are actually better than the ones in that more famous movie. I'd like to thank Fangoria for letting me see the movie in advance. I felt like my old friend Uncle Bob Martin, the creator of Fangoria, was sitting right there next to me. And I imagined him getting angry at the guy behind us who kept kicking our seats all through the picture. I think Bob would have liked the monsters though, and I think you will too. Werewolves opens in theaters this Friday, December 6, 2024. It's possibly today as you're viewing this. If you're looking for a scary werewolf movie, you will likely enjoy at least the second half of this one. One of the places we rarely discuss on this channel is the state of Kentucky, and yet Kentucky has a rich dogman and werewolf tradition stretching back generations. In this episode, we've collected just a few historical accounts of canines that walk on their hind legs like human beings, which have been reported over the years in the state. These stories are all taken from the book The Inhumanoids by Barton M. Nunnelly. Way back in April of 1944, there was a woman named Shirley working as a nurse in the hospital at Paintsville, Kentucky in Johnson County. A young man came in covered in scratches, with his mother telling him to just say he fell, and to stop talking about that fight he claimed he had with the strange fur-covered man. During that same night at that same hospital, they got a report of an accident caused by a tall, hairy creature in the road. Shirley remembered that strange night, wondering about the possible connections between those 2 incidents. Fast forward about 1 year later, Shirley got a new job at a restaurant and found herself working for that same young man and his mother. She and the young man married in June of 1945, and then she finally got to hear the backstory of what happened to him that first night when she met him on her old job as a nurse, when he came in covered in scratches. The man she married was named Ellis, and Ellis told his story this way. It was a dark and rainy day, almost as dark as night. He had been fishing and caught some catfish to give to his mother's restaurant. While he was cleaning the fish on a table lit by a very dim light bulb, up came a man covered in long, shaggy dog fur. Ellis at first thought that it was a teenager wearing some kind of a weird costume, but then the beast growled at him, pushing him out of the way, and made a grab for the catfish that he had been cleaning. Ellis took a glass bottle and conked the monster on his noggin. This only served to infuriate the thing, and it grabbed Ellis and shook him like a rag doll, hurling the man to the ground. The dogman then claimed his catfish prize and made off into the woods. He told Shirley that his mother had never believed him, and that she told him he'd be sent to a shrink if he said it was a werewolf that had done this to him. Nevertheless, he held to his story, insisting that the thing had blue eyes and the build of a teenager, although clearly it was far stronger than any teen. It couldn't have been human or bear, since it had a tail, and that tail bushed out excitedly when it saw those catfish. Let's skip ahead about 4 decades, but let's stay in the same general area of the world. In Ashland, Kentucky in the 1980s, there came a spate of sightings of a werewolf monster in the local cemetery. People said the beast could run on 2 legs or 4, and had been seen jumping over the 10-foot-high front gate of the graveyard in one bound. One time, 2 uniformed police officers responded to a report of the creature in the cemetery, and they found themselves face to face with the Ashland Cemetery werewolf itself. Turning on their heels and racing back to the cemetery's entrance, the cops were horrified to discover that it had been closed and locked. The police officers were forced to beg for help from the general public in order to gain their freedom. One witness from back then claimed he had encountered the monster on 2 separate occasions inside that graveyard. The first time, the headlights of a turning car illuminated an evil-looking creature with a wolf-like head and long fangs. As the witness watched, the dogman ducked down behind a tombstone. When the man approached that headstone, however, he found the beastman was no longer anywhere to be seen. The second time this witness saw the beast, he was with several friends and family members. On that occasion, the werewolf appeared on all 4s and chased them away. I find that very curious that it snuck away from the witness when he was alone, but when he returned with reinforcements, the beast decided to take the entire lot of them on. Seems like the opposite kind of behavior from what you might expect in each case. And it's not like he bluff charged the group either. It's said that he chased them through all the woods surrounding the cemetery before he finally gave up. What could have been different on those 2 occasions? What was he guarding the second time that he was not on the first? Was it food? Was it his mate? Or his family? But werewolf reports in the area would continue on into the next decade. In 1991, some people investigating a bridge in Boyd County that was said to be haunted heard strange sounds coming from the brush in the dark night. They thought the sound was coming from an old barn in the distance, and they started to walk toward it. They thought it might be deer and wanted to get a glimpse of them. As they walked toward the barn, they heard a terrible scream or roar, and turned to see a huge canine, larger than any they had ever seen, racing toward them on all 4s, shaking the ground as it thundered toward them. When it got to about 15 or 20 feet away, the creature reared up on its hind legs and displayed its full height, which was allegedly 16 feet up in the sky. They claimed it looked like a 16-foot tall man with a canine head. At this point, I feel I should pause and mention that these witness encounters were not submitted by my viewers, as on most of our episodes. No, all the stories I've been telling you so far are all from the historical record, as recounted in the 2017 book, The Inhumanoids, Real Encounters with Beings That Can't Exist. It's written by Barton M. Nunnelly, with an intro by Nick Redfern and a foreword by the late Linda Godfrey. I agree 16 feet is very tall, but I'm just telling you what it says in the book. We have a link in the description if you'd like to pick up your own copy of The Inhumanoids, so then you can fact check me. If you use that link in our description, you can earn this channel a small commission. At any rate, about that 16-foot dogman, the people said they ran to their car for safety. Luckily for them, another car happened to drive by just then, spooking the creature away. The next day, they returned to the site and discovered strange-looking footprints around. In 2001, in Greenup, Kentucky, a husband and wife were driving home in two separate cars. The wife's car had been acting up lately, so the two were carrying walkie-talkies with them. When the man saw his wife's car slowing down, he called her on the walkie-talkie, and she told him there was a large creature walking down the middle of the road, directly toward her. She went so far as to call the thing a monster. Finally, it came to a stop in front of her, and she was forced to put the brakes on herself. As the husband drove up behind this crazy scene, things got even crazier. The husband was forced to sit and watch as the beast easily bounded over the top of his wife's car, landing in the road in front of him. And then, the huge beast charged his car and did the same thing to him. Although it quickly disappeared into the darkness behind them, the man had gotten a good look at the creature in his headlights. He said it was a werewolf-looking thing, covered in shaggy hair all over. It had what he described as cruel-looking eyes, as well as long fangs and claws. The second the monster was behind them, the husband radioed his wife to go, 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 and they went out of that scene as fast as they could manage. There are other Werewolf and Dogman cases in this book, but it also has tons of other kinds of monsters. Not just Bigfoot, but lizard people and all kinds of strange beasties. He calls the book The Inhumanoids, but it has nothing at all to do with a cartoon TV show and toy line of the same name. Did the Inhumanoids ever have a werewolf toy? This episode is dedicated to our PayPal subscriber, James Fleming. James had been sending me updates about his health and upcoming surgeries, but I haven't heard from him for a while. I've been kind of bogged down with my own health issues and the health of those around me, but I am hoping James is doing okay. In either case, James Fleming has helped this channel out greatly for a long while, and we're sending out positive, thankful vibrations to him this evening. Thanks, James. My Werewolf Sensei. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I used to take kung fu classes from a madman whose name you couldn't pay me to mention. He is still alive, and he would come looking for me if he knew I was telling you this story. I'm about to reveal info that he wouldn't personally reveal to you, even if you trained with him for years. And the short version is that most of Sensei's power comes from the fact that he is, in actuality, a werewolf. Since I can't get into details that would reveal exactly who I'm talking about, it's hard to explain exactly what I was taking classes to learn. I guess it should hopefully be safe to say that I was being trained in hand-to-hand combat to defend a certain very important person. I had already received firearms training and would go on to be trained in other skills I'd rather leave out of this. So this was part of a long series of ways in which I was being educated into a very specific and demanding security position. The training was taking place in a certain mountain range in the United States which shall remain nameless. They had a somewhat hidden base of operations on the top of a steep little mountain, and this is where I would be spending 6 weeks with Sensei, being broken down and rebuilt into the man they needed me to be. Sensei was about my size when we met, and I had no idea he was anything except a human being. He was in excellent shape, especially considering that he must have been at least 10 years older than I was. There didn't seem to be an ounce of fat on him. Every atom of his body was there for a useful reason in that moment. He was the most intimidating man I've ever met, and also the most impressive. In addition to that, he was the cruelest, as I was put through such rigorous physical ordeals that on more than one occasion, I thought I was about to meet my maker. I wondered how these feats I was nearly terminated by merely attempting seemed easy for Sensei to do. I guess he might be using some kind of performance-enhancing substance. I was wrong to think that. but I was correct that his performance was most definitely enhanced. Nevertheless, assignments that nearly killed me in week 1 had become doable by week 3, and I was beginning to feel almost superhuman, thanks entirely to Sensei's training and his vision of what the training could achieve. While I still couldn't keep up with my master, I was becoming stronger and faster than anyone else I had ever seen at that young stage of my life. I remember the first time Sensei changed form in front of me. It was not a slow and painful affair like in the old movies. Sensei could change from human to werewolf so quickly that you had no choice but to become completely startled. And he could change back into a human and laugh at you, while your jaw was still hanging open from the werewolf sighting. He allowed me to watch him change forward and back over a dozen times that day before we ever had any physical contact. I was still wondering if the werewolf persona was just an illusion or projection of some sort. I thought he must be making me see things somehow. I assumed it was an Eastern technique, a mind-swaying power of some sort. Sensei himself was European, but everything he had taught me up to that point was from Asia, so I had thought that my seeing him as a werewolf must have been the result of some ancient mental technique from the East. Well, it was the result of something ancient. I at least had it right that far. What do I mean when I say I saw him transform into a werewolf or wolfman? Well, while he did grow a bit larger, it was basically him becoming an animal version of who he had already been. This is why I thought maybe these are his mental projections all around him. Once I got swiped by his Dogman claws, though, I realized that these were far more than mental projections. Sensei was somehow living in 2 different realities or dimensions at once, and he could switch realities on me as well, in some way I can't even fully describe, let alone explain. For instance, he hurt when he swiped me with his claws, and they ended up covered in red fluid that had once been inside me. Sensei then suddenly was his normal self with hands and not claws, and he was laughing at the confused look on my face. When he just as suddenly changed back to the werewolf form, those claws were somehow back to being covered in my personal red fluid. While Sensei had changed back to human form to laugh at me in my reality, the werewolf reality had somehow continued along with its own continuity, if that makes any sense at all. Like 2 different films running side by side, and Sensei was cutting back and forth between one and the other, in real time. It amused him how much this confused me. Him becoming a werewolf wasn't just a transformation. It meant something far more. And by that, I mean that more was going on there than I could even begin to understand. Not just to Sensei, but to the very reality around us itself. For a full week, my training consisted mainly of fending off surprise attacks from my Sensei, usually when he was in werewolf form. After 7 days of this, I had progressed enough in his estimation that the last week was spent in a test of survival. We were both to fend for ourselves, living off the land on the mountaintops for the entire week, and we would engage in battles randomly, at times of his choosing. Each time I subdued Sensei, I scored a point, and each time he had me at a point where he could have issued the killing blow, then he would have a point. I managed to match him win for win, but I knew this had mostly been just because luck had been on my side and not on his. One time he stepped on a patch of ice and slipped, enabling me to get away from him. Another time I slipped and my blow ended up landing far more cleanly than it would have if I didn't. It was sheer luck that was keeping me in the game, and keeping me alive as well. I don't remember how it started, and I also can't really remember very well how it developed, but I began to have a sense of when the werewolf was around. And by the werewolf I mean Sensei, no matter which form he was in. I got a sort of tingling feeling. It would start in my belly, then I would feel like I had to sneeze, except I didn't really have to. I began to notice that Sensei would launch an attack immediately after I had that weird sneezing feeling. I didn't get those weird tingles and itches when Sensei wasn't attacking. I was being warned somehow that I was in danger. Soon I was so in tune with this tingling sensation that Sensei was unable to get close enough to me to engage in hand-to-hand combat any longer. At that stage, there began to be a battle of projectiles. We each hurled stones and whatever we could find lying around at each other. It was the only form of battle left, because I refused to let Sensei get close enough to have it any other way. When the week drew to a close, Sensei walked up to me in his human form, and I did not sense the tingle of danger from his approach. He was coming to tell me that my training had ended, and that I had passed. At this point I was full of questions, and I blurted them all out. No doubt you have many of the same questions going through your head. Well, Sensei's answer was to lead me back to my belongings and give me a train ticket back to my master's office to receive my next instructions. I worked in high-level security positions for just under 2 decades, and in most of that time, I wondered why I was made to battle a werewolf for 6 weeks. Nothing like that ever came up on the job, and I was working a very complex, yet mostly pretty standard security position, guarding a person who was very important. I was, that is, until one night, when I suddenly got that weird tingling feeling in my belly that I hadn't felt since I was up in the mountains with Sensei. When I felt a sneeze coming on, alarm shot through me, and I spun around just in time to intercept a deadly attack from a werewolf every bit as savage-looking as my Sensei had been years prior. He had claws that seemed to be 2 inches long or longer, and so most of my efforts were spent on moving out of the way of his attacks, and keeping some distance between us. I was able to fling rocks in his direction to greater advantage than I might have hoped. I did not think I could survive long against those claws in close combat, so using the technique of rock throwing that I had learned up in the mountains seemed my only choice. I was able to defend myself until he gave up and ran off. I never saw another werewolf for the rest of my career, but the training I received early on was what saved my life that night. And I guess that's my story of the time when I had a werewolf sensei. I wondered who's today's EP, and then I had an epiphany. Our executive producer is Ms. Walsh, aka Tiffany. Please join me in thanking Tiffany Walsh for making this episode possible. Tiffany is a member in good standing of our PayPal subscribers club, which is going to have a new secret uncensored story coming out in the next 36 to 48 hours, God willing. Also, all members like Tiffany at the $3 level and above will be receiving links this Christmas time to 2 more 5-hour-long marathons of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Werewolf and Drone, over New Jersey. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I saw a UFO and a werewolf both at the same time last night, and I think the one was related to the other. This happened in West Milford, New Jersey, less than 50 miles away from New York City. My friends and I went out for a ride to spook ourselves on Clinton Road because we had heard that it was haunted. Well, we didn't see any ghosts, but we sure had a memorable evening, to say the least. We were driving on a stretch of road through the country and the woods. Over there, Clinton Road is just 2 lanes with yellow stripes painted down the middle, and a whole lot of spooky-looking forest all around you. There are no lights, and the time we were out last night, we didn't see any other traffic. My buddy saw the weird light first, off in the distance. It was sometimes orangey, sometimes greenish, sometimes white-ish. Sometimes it was 1 light and other times there was 3 of them. He was talking about this to me for a while before they came down low enough that I could see them through the front windshield. Sure enough, there was a dark UFO or UAP or something, probably about the same size as my car but shaped sort of triangular, I guess you would say. It was dark against the dark sky. Then it had 3 lights, 1 on each corner. Not exactly triangular, but mostly. My buddy was describing what he was seeing, and it matched up about 80% of the time with what I was seeing. The trouble is, sometimes we seem to be seeing different things. We kept going in and out of sync with each other, and my buddy had the idea that we were seeing something from another dimension or reality that had the ability to be different things to different people. All at once, the triangular craft lit up very brightly, and beneath it was a tall, hairy man, which we could only see in silhouette. As the light moved from behind him to overhead, though, we could see that he had a head like a dog or wolf. He appeared to stand and move like a human, but he was more like some kind of a werewolf than a man. Both of us screamed, and I hit the brakes on the car, afraid to get any closer to that scene. So instead, the scene moved itself closer to us. The werewolf took notice of us and started to walk over. As it did so, the UFO hovered a little closer as well. My buddy yelled at me to back the car up, so I switched it into reverse. However, when I did that, the engine conked out and sputtered into complete silence. At the time, I thought it was because of the cold, but now we both wonder if the engine failure had to do with that strange flying machine. The werewolf or dogman was still approaching, so I tried to turn the key in the ignition over and over and over again. I could not get it to start. Both of us in that car were screaming and weeping like little girls in kindergarten. Buddy panicked and got out of the car, but the dogman started moving in his direction, and he got right back into my Mazda inside of 2 seconds. I told him if he did that again, I'd leave him there, and he pointed out that I would have to get the car engine started before I could do that. The dogman kept approaching and then retreating. It seemed as spooked by us as we were by it, but I don't know why, since it was super huge. I mean, taller than a bear, but with more of a human bodybuilder kind of a physique. The lights in the sky changed color a few times, but in a subtle manner, and they weren't like disco lights. The colors were sort of more muted and weird. Not your typical shades that you see every day, but they were very bright. I kept thinking I saw things flying out of the forest and up into the ship or whatever that UFO was, but I'm not 100% certain. My friend said he saw things that were dark and kept changing their shape as they flew up out of the bushes and into the craft. I'm not sure what we were actually looking at when that was going on, and I'm probably not describing it very well either. I mean, in the moment I thought they were living creatures, but they kept morphing and warping in shape. At any rate, it was dark and neither of us could be certain what we were seeing as far as that went. The wolfman or dogman was acting so nervous, he was making me more nervous too. I felt like I had to go to the bathroom, and I felt a sort of a deep sense of hopelessness and doom. My friend next to me, though, he was continuing to freak out and panic. He reached across me and started banging on the car horn as loud and hard as he could. Well, the UFOs might be able to turn your car engine off, but they don't seem to have figured out how to lower the volume on your old car horn. The dogman got so scared by the beeping, I thought he was about to leap straight up into the air and climb up into that UFO. He couldn't stand the noise. I can't say exactly how it happened, but the dogman and the UFO both left. My buddy says the wolfman got sucked up into the UFO, and then they flew away. But what I remember seeing was that they both sort of got pinched by the back of them, and then kind of pulled out of our reality. Like it wasn't so much they went somewhere else, as they stopped being where they were. Does that make any sense? So anyway, we sat there for a while in the dark, just sort of catching our breath and getting over the shock a bit. My buddy pointed to the clock on my dashboard and said it must be wrong. I looked over and saw what he meant. If that clock was right, then we had been there for over an hour. It only seemed as though we'd been there for maybe 3 or 4 minutes maximum. We both checked our phones, and sure enough, we really both had been there for something like 65 or 70 minutes. Then my friend was like, "Hey, how come we only just decided to check our phones now? Like, how come we didn't take any pictures of that UFO or the monster?" Neither of us could explain it. Then Buddy said, "Why don't you try starting the car?" I did, and it worked. Anyway, that's our story. Make of it what you will. Addendum. Hey, my friend tells me that people were seeing UFOs all over the state of New Jersey on December 10th, which is the night when we saw what we saw. They're calling them drones, though. One of our congressmen is saying they're from Iraq or Iran or something. If that's true, then they've got some pretty advanced equipment over there in that desert. And I hope someone is still in charge of the U.S. military who can deal with this until the next executive takes charge. Let's pray this is not as bad as it could be. Let's pray for our country and for each other.
sky. Some classic all over, but it understandable to local. Available in white, black, navy, gray, or pink. Link is in the description.
Tonight we'd like to thank Sharon Smirnoff, our executive producer for this episode. Sharon is a member of our PayPal Subscribers Club, which means she got to see our recent Secret Uncensored Members Only Dogman story. To find out more, listen to our TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal Subscribers Club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.